As confirmed cases approach 2 million and deaths surpass 100,000, the COVID-19 situation looks more grim every day. Even as some optimistically claim that the light at the end of the tunnel is within sight, we have to ask ourselves, what does that light at the end of the tunnel really entail? Not only are experts predicting an unprecedented economic crisis, a decline in international cooperation, and a Christmas-time baby boom, there's also the serious question of whether the pandemic will have lasting effects on global democracy. Already in the past few months, leaders from countries like Hungary, the Philippines, and Cambodia have used panic to justify dangerous expansions of their power, including heavy limitations on free press. In Israel, the court system was shut down, a very convenient fact for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was due to face criminal charges this spring. To discuss why authoritarianism is escalating and what effect this will have on the post-coronavirus world, I reached out to former diplomat and author Mietek Boduszyński.
Professor Boduszyński, now that we find ourselves in the middle of this global pandemic, one concern is not only how do we save the world, but what world are we going to be facing in the aftermath of the crisis? As more and more leaders of countries across the world are using the pandemic to justify an expansion of their power, what do you think the toll will be on democracy?
I think the more likely scenario is that quite a few governments around the world that are already authoritarian have seized upon this crisis to expand the powers of the current, whoever's in power, the current party, the current strong person, usually it's a strong man in power, and stifle dissent and marginalize the opposition further, using the justification that they need these extra powers, they need this extra authority in order to confront the pandemic.
The most prominent authoritarian regime in this situation is without a doubt the People's Republic of China. Professor Boduszyński explained how China's government shaped their response to the pandemic.
There was an obvious attempt to cover up, silence, marginalize professionals, doctors, especially most dramatically, the one doctor who later died from the coronavirus. I don't remember his name, who tried to sound the alarm early on and was arrested by the police. And so you may look at that scenario and say, well, this shows how authoritarian governments like the People's Republic of China are unprepared to deal with pandemics, and the withholding of information and the silencing of experts, arguably made the situation worse.
Going right off of that, I know that, taking the example of China, which you mentioned, the World Health Organization praised the response to the situation. Yeah. Do you think that authoritarian regimes might be better equipped to cope with these kind of situations?
Yeah, and I was hoping you would ask that, because I've been kind of thinking through this myself. So I think they're equipped to do certain things, right? I mean, they're equipped to, compel people to stay indoors, and people are more afraid of, breaking the law in authoritarian countries and police states because the repercussions can be quite severe, and because they're already afraid of, the police and the secret services and so on. So I think on measures like that, I think, yes, absolutely.
There are certain scholars who have claimed that in the long run, democracies are better equipped to cope with pandemics. For example, having a free press can allow governments to learn from their mistakes and adapt in the future. However, Professor Boduszyński was skeptical of this, bringing up how today, the press and the public in today's Western democracies are so polarized that free press and free speech can sometimes be detrimental to dealing with these crises.
We have a free press, I think, here, and there's a free press in most European countries, but because of the level of polarization and the fact that people kind of read their perspective mostly, follow the media that conforms to their perspective, or read sound bites, or kind of social media postings that conforms to their perspective, as well, coupled with disinformation, actually can make things worse.
One additional concern is that as these democracies struggle to address the pandemic, efforts to promote democracy abroad will be left behind.
I know that your area of expertise, or at least your last book, was on the promotion of democracy. Do you think that this will shape the way that the promotion of democracy changes in the future?
I think that, Western governments would be democracy promoters. So here I'm talking about Europe, I'm talking about the US, maybe to some degree, Japan, South Korea, some other non-Western democratic countries that do some democracy promotion activities. around the world, or promotion of human rights less broadly. I think they're very distracted by this crisis, and I think it's just not a priority. And I mean, usually it's not a priority anyway. And I think, again, we were at an authoritarian moment before this started. It was certainly not a priority, and it's not going to be a priority now.
But if the world's most prominent democracies are falling behind in their efforts to contain the pandemic, let alone focusing on promoting democracy elsewhere, there's a real concern about the future of democracy on a global scale.
For my final question, I want to go back kind of to the beginning of the conversation, back to China, because even before this pandemic, there was talks about whether China was going to surpass the United States as the biggest economy, the biggest world power. Do you think that this virus increases the likelihood of that, and what effect would that have on democracy across the world?
My sense is that, I mean, some of that was, in terms of the size of China's economy, its growing military, as a challenger to the U.S., that was already happening. And I think that to the extent that, the failure of the U.S. government to respond to this crisis early on, the fact that, we still don't have the tests available and all this, really, I think, lowers U.S. soft power. It changes the way people see the U.S., right? I think one thing that we always had over the Chinese is that, at the end of the day, they've had amazing economic growth and they've brought a lot of people out of poverty, but their ideology is not charismatic, right? I mean, the U.S. system, the U.S. model, for whatever that is, despite all its internal problems, has always the model of an open society, of a diverse society, of a society in which an immigrant can come and become very successful, has always been a charismatic one, right? And I don't think that China had that, but now I think seeing the limitations of our response and the large number, rapid rate of transmission, large number of deaths, lack of testing, lack of masks, lack of ventilators and other equipment and preparation, and that casts that in a harsh light. So I think on the soft power part, maybe China can profit.
Veronica BP, Election 2020, Los Angeles.